Section 23. No man can see over his own height. Let me explain what I mean. You cannot see in another man any more than you have in yourself, and your own intelligence strictly determines the extent to which he comes within its grasp. If your intelligence is of a very low order, mental qualities in another, even though they be of the highest kind, will have no effect at all upon you. You will see nothing in their possessor except the meanest side of his individuality. In other words, just those parts of his character and disposition which are weak and defective. Your whole estimate of the man will be confined to his defects, and his higher mental qualities will no more exist for you than colors exist for those who cannot see. Intellect is invisible to the man who has none. In any attempt to criticize another's work, the range of knowledge possessed by the critic is as essential a part of his verdict as the claims of the work itself. Hence, intercourse with others involves a process of leveling down. The qualities which are present in one man and absent in another cannot come into play when they meet, and the self-sacrifice which this entails upon one of the parties calls forth no recognition from the other. Consider how sordid, how stupid, and in a word, how vulgar most men are, and you will see that it is impossible to talk to them without becoming vulgar yourself for the time being. Vulgarity is in this respect like electricity. It is easily distributed. You will then fully appreciate the truth and propriety of the expression to make yourself cheap, and you will be glad to avoid the society of people whose only possible point of contact with you is just that part of your nature which you have least reason to be proud. So you will see that, in dealing with fools and blockheads, there is only one way of showing your intelligence, by having nothing to do with them. That means, of course, that when you go into society, you may now and then feel like a good dancer who gets an invitation to a ball, and on arriving finds that everyone is lame. With whom is he to dance? Section 24. I feel respect for the man, and he is 1 in 100 who, when he is waiting or sitting unoccupied, refrains from rattling or beating time with anything that happens to be handy, his stick, or knife and fork, or whatever else it may be. The probability is that he is thinking of something. With a large number of people, it is quite evident that their power of sight completely dominates over their power of thought. They seem to be conscious of existence only when they are making a noise, unless indeed they happen to be smoking, for this serves a similar end. It is for this same reason that they never fail to be all eyes and ears for what is going on around them. Section 25. La Rochefoucauld makes the striking remark that it is difficult to feel deep veneration and great affection for one and the same person. If this is so, we shall have to choose whether it is veneration or love that we want from our fellow men. Their love is always selfish, though in very different ways, and the means used to gain it are not always of a kind to make us proud. A man is loved by others mainly in the degree in which he moderates his claim on their good feeling and intelligence. But he must act genuinely in the matter and without dissimulation, not merely out of forbearance, which is at the bottom a kind of contempt. This calls to mind a very true observation of Helvetius. The amount of intellect necessary to please us is a most accurate measure of the amount of intellect we have ourselves. With these remarks as premises, it is easy to draw the conclusion. Now, with veneration, the case is just the opposite. It is wrung from men reluctantly, and for that very reason mostly concealed. Hence, as compared with love, veneration gives more real satisfaction, for it is connected with personal value, and the same is not directly true of love, which is subjective in nature, whilst veneration is objective. To be sure, it is more useful to be loved than to be venerated. Section 26. Most men are so thoroughly subjective that nothing really interests them but themselves. They always think of their own case as soon as ever any remark is made, and their whole attention is engrossed and absorbed by the merest chance reference to anything which affects them personally, be it never so remote, with the result that they have no power left for forming an objective view of things, should the conversation take that turn. Neither can they admit any validity in arguments which tell against their interest or their vanity. Hence their attention is easily distracted. They are so readily offended, insulted, or annoyed that in discussing any impersonal matter with them, no care is too great to avoid letting your remarks bear the slightest possible reference to the very worthy and sensitive individuals whom you have before you, for anything you may say will perhaps hurt their feelings. People really care about nothing that does not affect them personally. True and striking observations, fine, subtle, and witty things are lost upon them. They cannot understand or feel them. But anything that disturbs their petty vanity in the most remote and indirect way, or reflects prejudicially upon their exceedingly precious selves, to that they are most tenderly sensitive. In this respect they are like the little dog whose toes you are so apt to tread upon inadvertently. You know it by the shrill bark it sets up. Or again, they resemble a sick man covered with sores and boils, with whom the greatest care must be taken to avoid unnecessary handling. And in some people this feeling reaches such a pass that, if they are talking with anyone, and he exhibits, or does not sufficiently conceal, his intelligence and discernment, they look upon it as a downright insult, although for the moment they hide their ill will, and the unsuspecting author of it afterwards ruminates in vain upon their conduct, and racks his brain to discover what he could possibly have done to excite their malice and hatred. But it is just as easy to flatter and win them over, and this is why their judgment is usually corrupt, and why their opinions are swayed, not by what is really true and right, but by the favor of the party or class to which they belong. And the ultimate reason of it all is that in such people force of will greatly predominates over knowledge, and hence their meager intellect is wholly given up to the service of the will, and can never free itself from that service for a moment. Astrology furnishes a magnificent proof of this miserable subjective tendency in men, which leads them to see everything only as bearing upon themselves, and to think of nothing that is not straightway made into a personal matter. The aim of astrology is to bring the motions of celestial bodies into relation with the wretched ego, and to establish a connection between a comet in the sky and squabbles and rascalities on earth. Section 27. When any wrong statement is made, whether in public or in society, or in books, and well received, or at any rate not refuted, that is no reason why you should despair or think there the matter will rest. You should comfort yourself with the reflection that the question will afterwards gradually subjected to examination. Light will be thrown upon it. It will be thought over, considered, discussed, and generally, in the end, the correct view will be reached, so that, after a time, the length of which will depend upon the difficulty of the subject, everyone will come to understand that which a clear head saw at once. In the meantime, of course, you must have patience. He who can see truly in the midst of a general infatuation is like a man whose watch keeps good time, when all the clocks in the town in which he lives are wrong. He alone knows the right time, but what use is that to him? For everyone goes by the clocks which speak false, not even excepting those who know that his watch is the only one that is right. Section 28. Men are like children, in that if you spoil them, they become naughty. Therefore, it is well not to be too indulgent or charitable with anyone. You may take it as a general rule that you will not lose a friend by refusing him a loan, but that you are very likely to do so by granting it. And, for similar reasons, You will not readily alienate people by being somewhat proud and careless in your behavior, but if you are very kind and complacent towards them, you will often make them arrogant and intolerable, and so a breach will ensue. There is one thing that, more than any other, throws people absolutely off their balance: the thought that you are dependent upon them. This is sure to produce an insolent and domineering manner towards you. There are some people, indeed, who become rude if you enter into any kind of relation with them. For instance, if you have occasion to converse with them frequently upon confidential matters, they soon come to fancy that they can take liberties with you, and so they try and transgress the laws of politeness. This is why there are so few with whom you care to become more intimate, and why you should avoid familiarity with vulgar people. If a man comes to think that I am more dependent upon him than he is upon me, he at once feels as though I had stolen something from him, and his endeavor will be to have his vengeance and get it back. The only way to attain superiority in dealing with men is to let it be known that you are independent of them. And in this view it is advisable to let everyone of your acquaintance, whether man or woman, feel now and then that you could very well dispose with their company. This will consolidate friendship. Nay, with most people there will be no harm in occasionally mixing a grain of disdain with your treatment of them. That will make them value your friendship all the more. Chi non estima vien stimato, as a subtle Italian proverb has it, to disregard is to win regard. But if we really think very highly of a person, we should conceal it from him like a crime. This is not a very gratifying thing to do, but it is right. Why, a dog will not bear being treated too kindly, let alone a man. Section 29. It is often the case that people of noble character and great mental gifts betray a strange lack of worldly wisdom and a deficiency in the knowledge of men, more especially when they are young, with the result that it is easy to deceive or mislead them, and that, on the other hand, natures of the commoner sort are more ready and successful in making their way in the world. The reason of this is that, when a man has little or no experience, he must judge by his own antecedent notions, and in matters demanding judgment, an antecedent notion is never on the same level as experience. For, with the commoner sort of people, an antecedent notion means just their own selfish point of view. This is not the case with those whose mind and character are above the ordinary, for it is precisely in this respect, their unselfishness, that they differ from the rest of mankind. And as they judge other people's thoughts and actions by their own high standard, the result does not always tally with their calculation. But if, in the end, a man of noble character comes to see, as the effect of his own experience, or by the lessons he learns from others, what it is that may be expected of men in general, namely, that 5/6 of them are morally and intellectually so constituted that, if circumstances do not place you in relation with them, you had better get out of their way, and keep as far as possible from having anything to do with them. Still, he will scarcely ever attain an adequate notion of their wretchedly mean and shabby nature. All his life long he will have to be extending and adding to the inferior estimate he forms of them, and in the meantime he will commit a great many mistakes, and do himself harm. Then, again, after he has really taken to heart the lessons that have been taught him, it will occasionally happen that, when he is in the society of people whom he does not know, he will be surprised to find how thoroughly reasonable they all appear to be, both in their conversation and in their demeanor. In fact, quite honest, sincere, virtuous, and trustworthy people, and at the same time shrewd and clever. But that ought not to perplex him. Nature is not like those bad poets who, in setting a fool or a knave before us, do their work so clumsily and with such evident design that you might almost fancy you saw the poet standing behind each of his characters, and continually disavowing their sentiments, and telling you in a tone of warning, "This is a knave, that is a fool, do not mind what he says." But nature goes to work like Shakespeare and Goethe, poets who make every one of their characters even if he is the devil himself, appear to be quite in the right for the moment that they come before us in their several parts. The characters are described so objectively that they excite our interest and compel us to sympathize with their point of view. For, like the works of nature, every one of these characters is evolved as the result of some hidden law or principle, which makes all that they say and do appear natural and therefore necessary. And you will always be the prey or the plaything of the devils and the fools in this world, if you expect to see them going about with horns or jangling their bells. And it should be borne in mind that, in the intercourse with others, people are like the moon, or like hunchbacks. They show you only one of their sides. Every man has an innate talent for mimicry, for making a mask out of his physiognomy, so that he can always look as if he were really what he pretends to be, and since he makes his calculations always within the lines of his individual nature, the appearance he puts on suits him to a nicety, and its effect is extremely deceptive. He dons his mask whenever his object is to flatter himself into someone's good opinion, and you may pay just as much attention to it as if it were made of wax or cardboard, never forgetting that excellent Italian proverb, non si tristo cane che non mene la coda. There is no dog so bad but that he will wag his tail. In any case, it is well to take care not to form a highly favorable opinion of a person whose acquaintance you have only recently made, for otherwise you are very likely to be disappointed, and then you will be ashamed of yourself and perhaps even suffer some injury. And while I am on the subject, there is another fact that deserves mention. It is this: a man shows his character just in the way in which he deals with trifles, for then he is off his guard. This will often afford a good opportunity of observing the boundless egoism of man's nature, and his total lack of consideration for others. And if these defects show themselves in small things, or merely in his general demeanor, you will find that they also underlie his action in matters of importance, although he may disguise the fact. This is an opportunity which should not be missed. If, in the little affairs of every day, the trifles of life, those matters to which the rule, de minimis non, applies, a man is inconsiderate and seeks only what is advantageous or convenient to himself, much to the prejudice of others' rights. If he appropriates to himself that which belongs to all alike, you may be sure there is no justice in his heart, and that he would be a scoundrel on a wholesale scale, only that law and compulsion bind his hands. Do not trust him beyond your door. He who is not afraid to break the laws of his own private circle will break those of the state when he can do so with impunity. If the average man were so constituted that the good in him outweighed the bad, it would be more advisable to rely upon his sense of justice, fairness, gratitude, fidelity, love, or compassion, than to work upon his fears. But as the contrary is the case, and it is the bad that outweighs the good, the opposite course is the more prudent one. If any person with whom we are associated or have to do exhibits unpleasant or annoying qualities, we have only to ask ourselves whether or not this person is of so much value to us that we can put up with frequent and repeated exhibitions of the same qualities in a somewhat aggravated form. In the case of an affirmative answer to this question, there will not be much to be said, because talking is very little use. We must let the matter pass, with or without some notice, but we should nevertheless remember that we are thereby exposing ourselves to a repetition of the offense. If the answer is in the negative, we must break with our worthy friend at once and forever, or in the case of a servant, dismiss him, for he will inevitably repeat the offense, or do something tantamount to it, should the occasion return, even though for the moment he is deep and sincere in his assurances of the contrary. There is nothing, absolutely nothing, that a man cannot forget, but not himself, his own character. For character is incorrigible, because all a man's actions emanate from an inward principle. in virtue of which he must always do the same thing under like circumstances, and he cannot do otherwise. Let me refer to my prize essay on the so-called freedom of the will, the perusal of which will dissipate any delusions the reader may have on the subject. To become reconciled to a friend with whom you have broken is a form of weakness, and you pay the penalty of it when he takes the first opportunity of doing precisely the very thing which brought about the breach. Nay, he does it the more boldly, because he is secretly conscious that you cannot get on without him. This is also applicable to servants whom you have dismissed, and then taken into your service once again. For the same reason, you should just as little expect people to continue to act in a similar way under altered circumstances. The truth is that men alter their demeanor and sentiments just as fast as their interest changes, and their resign in this respect is a bill drawn for short payment, that the man must still be more short-sighted who accepts the bill without protesting it. Accordingly, suppose you want to know how a man will behave in an office into which you think of putting him. You should not build upon expectations, on his promises or assurances, for, even allowing that he is quite sincere, he is speaking about a matter of which he has no knowledge. The only way to calculate how he will behave is to consider the circumstances in which he will be placed, and the extent to which they will conflict with his character. If you wish to get a clear and profound insight, and it is very needful indeed, into the true but melancholy elements of which most men are made, you will find in a very instructive thing to take the way they behave in the pages of literature as a commentary to their doings in practical life, and vice versa. The experience thus gained will be very useful in avoiding wrong ideas, whether about yourself or about others. But if you come across any special trait of meanness or stupidity in life or in literature, you must be careful not to let it annoy or distress you, but to look upon it merely as an addition to your knowledge, a new fact to be considered in studying the character of humanity. Your attitude towards it will be that of the mineralogist who stumbles upon a very characteristic specimen of a mineral. Of course, there are some facts which are very exceptional, and it is difficult to understand how they arise, and how it is that there came to be such enormous differences between man and man. But, in general, what was said long ago is quite true, and the world is in a very bad way. In savage countries, they eat one another. In civilized, they deceive one another. And that is what people call the way of the world. What are states and all the elaborate systems of political machinery and the rule of force, whether in home or in foreign affairs? What are they but barriers against the boundless iniquity of mankind? Does not all of history show that whenever a king is firmly planted on a throne, and his people reach some degree of prosperity, he uses it to lead his army like a band of robbers against adjoining countries? Are not almost all wars ultimately undertaken for the purposes of plunder? In the most remote antiquity, and to some extent also in the Middle Ages, the conquered became slaves. In other words, they had to work for those who conquered them. And where is the difference between that and paying war taxes, which represent the product of our previous work? All of war, says Voltaire, is a matter of robbery, and the Germans should take that as a warning. Section 30. No man is so formed that he can be left entirely to himself, to go his own ways. Everyone needs to be guided by a preconceived plan, and to follow certain general rules. But if this is carried too far, and a man tries to take on a character which is not natural or innate in him, but it artificially acquired and evolved merely by a process of reasoning, he will very soon discover that nature cannot be forced, and that if you drive it out, it will return despite your efforts. Naturam expellis furca, tamen usque recorret. To understand a rule governing conduct towards others, even to discover it for oneself and to express it neatly, is easy enough. and still, very soon afterwards, the rule may be broken in practice. But that is no reason for despair, and you need not fancy that, as it is impossible to regulate your life in accordance with abstract ideas and maxims, it is better to live just as you please. Here, as in all theoretical instruction that aims at a practical result, the first thing to do is to understand the rule. The second thing is to learn the practice of it. The theory may be understood at once by an effort of reason, and yet the practice of it acquired only in course of time. A pupil may learn the various notes on an instrument of music, or the different positions in fencing, and when he makes a mistake, as he is sure to do, however hard he tries, he is apt to think it will be impossible to observe the rules. When he is set to read music at sight or challenged to a furious duel, but for all that, gradual practice makes him perfect through a long series of slips, blunders, and fresh efforts. It is just the same in other things. In learning to write and speak Latin, a man will forget the grammatical rules. It is only by long practice that a blockhead turns into a courtier, that a passionate man becomes shrewd and worldly wise, or a frank person reserved, or a noble person ironical. But though self-discipline of this kind is the result of long habit, it always works by a sort of external compulsion, which nature never ceases to resist, and sometimes unexpectedly overcomes. The difference between action in accordance with abstract principles and action as the result of original, innate tendency is the same as that between a work of art, say a watch, where form and movement are impressed upon shapeless and inert matter, and a living organism, where form and matter are one, and each is inseparable from the other. There is a maxim attributed to the Emperor Napoleon, which expresses this relation between acquired and innate character, and confirms what I have said. Everything that is unnatural is imperfect, a rule of universal application, whether in the physical or in the moral sphere. The only exception I can think of to this rule is aventurine, a substance known to mineralogists, which, in its natural state, cannot compare with the artificial preparation of it. And in this connection, let me utter a word of protest against any and every form of affectation. It always arouses contempt in the first place, because it argues deception, and the deception is cowardly, for it is based on fear. And secondly, it argues self-condemnation, because it means that a man is trying to appear what he is not, and therefore something which he thinks better than he actually is. To affect a quality and to plume yourself upon it is just to confess that you have not got it. Whether it is courage or learning or intellect or wit or success with women or riches or social position or whatever else it may be that a man boasts of, you may conclude by his boasting about it that that is precisely the direction in which he is rather weak. For if a man really possesses any faculty to the full, it will not occur to him to make a great show of affecting it. He is quite content to know that he has it. That is the application of the Spanish proverb, herradura que chocolatea clavo le falta. A clattering hoof means a nail gone. To be sure, as I said at first, no man ought to let the reins go quite loose, and show himself just as he is, for there are many evil and bestial sides to our nature which require to be hidden away out of sight, and this justifies the negative attitude of dissimulation, but it does not justify a positive feigning of qualities which are not there. It should also be remembered that affectation is recognized at once, even before it is clear what it is that is being affected. And finally, affectation cannot last very long, and one day the mask will fall off. No one can persevere long in a fictitious character, for nature will soon reassert itself, says Seneca. Section 31. A man bears the weight of his own body without knowing it, but he soon feels the weight of any other if he tries to move it. In the same way, a man can see other people's shortcomings and vices, but he is blind to his own. This arrangement has one advantage. It turns other people into a kind of mirror, in which a man can see clearly everything that is vicious, faulty, ill-bred, and loathsome in his own nature. Only, it is generally the old story of the dog barking at its own image. It is himself that he sees, and not another dog, as he fancies. He who criticizes others works at the reformation of himself. Those who form the secret habit of scrutinizing other people's general behavior and passing severe judgment upon what they do and leave undone, thereby improve themselves and work out their own perfection. For they will have sufficient sense of justice, or at any rate enough pride and vanity, to avoid in their own case that which they condemn so harshly elsewhere. But tolerant people are just the opposite, and claim for themselves the same indulgence that they extend to others. It is all very well for the Bible to talk about the mote in another's eye and the beam in one's own. The nature of the eye is to look not at itself but at other things, and therefore to observe and blame faults in another is a very suitable way of becoming conscious of one's own. We require a looking-glass for the due dressing of our morals. The same rule applies in the case of style and fine writing. If, instead of condemning, you applaud some new folly in these matters, you will imitate it. That is just why literary follies have such vogue in Germany. The Germans are a very tolerant people. Everybody can see that. Section 32. When he is young, a man of noble character fancies that the relations prevailing amongst mankind, and the alliances to which these relations lead, are at bottom and essentially ideal in their nature. That is to say, that they rest upon similarity of disposition or sentiment, or taste, or intellectual power, and so on. But later on, he finds out that it is a real foundation which underlies these alliances, that they are based upon some material interest. This is the true foundation of almost all alliances. Nay, most men have no notion of an alliance resting upon any other basis. Accordingly, we find that a man is always measured by the office he holds, or by his occupation, nationality, or family relations. In a word, by the position and character which have been assigned him in the conventional arrangements of life, where he is ticketed and treated as so much goods. Reference to what he is in himself, as a man, to the measure of his own personal qualities, is never made unless for convenience's sake, and so that view of a man is something exceptional, to be set aside and ignored, the moment that anyone finds it disagreeable, and this is what usually happens. But the more of personal worth a man has, the less pleasure he will take in these conventional arrangements, and he will try to withdraw from the sphere in which they apply. The reason why these arrangements exist at all is simply that in this world of ours, misery and need are the chief features. Therefore, it is everywhere the essential and paramount business of life to devise the means of alleviating them. Section 33. As paper money circulates in the world instead of real coin, so is the place of true esteem and genuine friendship. You have the outward appearance of it, a mimic show made to look as much like the real thing as possible. On the other hand, it may be asked whether there are any people who really deserve the true coin. For my own part, I should certainly pay more respect to an honest dog wagging his tail than to 100 such demonstrations of human regard. True and genuine friendship supposes a strong sympathy with the weal and woe of another, purely objective in its character and quite disinterested. And this, in its turn, means an absolute identification of self with the object of friendship. The egoism of human nature is so strongly antagonistic to any such sympathy that true friendship belongs to that class of things, the sea serpent, for instance, with regard to which no one knows whether they are fabulous or really exist somewhere or other. Still, in many cases, there is a grain of true and genuine friendship in the relation of man to man, though generally, of course, some secret personal interest is at the bottom of them, some one among the many forms that selfishness can take. But in a world where all is imperfect, this grain of true feeling is such an ennobling influence that it gives some warrant for calling those relations by the name of friendship, for they stand far above the ordinary friendships that prevail amongst mankind. The latter are so constituted that, were you to hear how your dear friends speak of you behind your back, you would never say another word to them. Apart from the case where it would be a real help to you if your friend were to make some great sacrifice to serve you, there is no better means of testing the genuineness of his feelings than the way in which he receives the news of a misfortune that has just happened to you. At that moment, the expression of his features will either show that his one thought is that of true and sincere sympathy for you, or else the absolute composure of his countenance, or the passing trace of something other than sympathy, will confirm the well-known maxim of La Rochefoucauld, which is, indeed, at such a moment, the ordinary so-called friend will find it hard to suppress the signs of a slight smile of pleasure. There are few ways by which you can make more certain of putting people into a good humor than by telling them of some trouble that has recently befallen you, or by unreservedly disclosing some personal weakness of yours. How characteristic this is of humanity! Distance and long absence are always prejudicial to friendship, however disinclined a man may be to admit. Our regard for people whom we do not see, even though they be our dearest friends, gradually dries up in the course of years, and they become abstract notions, so that our interest in them grows to be more and more intellectual. Nay, it is kept up only as a kind of tradition, whilst we retain a lively and deep interest in those who are constantly before our eyes, even if they be only pet animals. This shows how much men are limited by their senses, and how true is the remark that Goethe makes in Tasso about the dominant influence of the present moment. Die Gegenwart ist ein mächtiger Gotten. Friends of the house are very rightly so called, because they are friends of the house rather than of its master. In other words, they are more like cats than dogs. Your friends will tell you that they are sincere. Your enemies are really so. Let your enemy's censure be like a bitter medicine, to be used as a means of self-knowledge. A friend in need, as the saying goes, is rare. Nay, it is just the contrary. No sooner have you made a friend than he is in need and asks for a loan. Section 34. A man must be still a greenhorn in the ways of the world if he imagines that he can make himself popular in society by exhibiting intelligence and discernment. With the immense majority of people, such qualities excite hatred and resentment, which are rendered all the harder to bear by the fact that people are obliged to suppress, even from themselves, the real reason of their anger. What actually takes place is this: a man feels and perceives that the person with whom he is conversing is intellectually very much his superior. He thereupon, secretly and half unconsciously, concludes that his interlocutor must form a proportionately low and limited estimate of his abilities. That is a method of reasoning, a enthymeme, which rouses the bitterest feelings of sullen and rancorous hatred. And so Gracian is quite right in saying that the only way to win affection from people is to show the most animal-like simplicity of demeanor. Para ser ben quisto, el único medio vestirse la piel del más simple de los brutos. To show your intelligence and discernment is only an indirect way of reproaching other people for being dull and incapable. And besides, it is natural for a vulgar man to be violently agitated by the sight of opposition in any form, and in this case envy comes in as the secret cause of his hostility. For It is a matter of daily observation that people take the greatest pleasure in that which satisfies their vanity, and vanity cannot be satisfied without comparison with others. Now, there is nothing of which a man is prouder than of intellectual ability, for it is this that gives him his commanding place in the animal world. It is an exceedingly rash thing to let anyone see that you are decidedly superior to him in this respect, and to let other people see it too, because he will then thirst for vengeance, and generally will look about for an opportunity of taking it by means of insult, because this is to pass from the sphere of intellect to that of will, and there all are on an equal footing as regards the feeling of hostility. Hence, while rank and riches may always reckon upon deferential treatment in society, that is something which intellectual ability can never expect. To be ignored is the greatest favor shown to it, and if people notice it at all, it is because they regard it as a piece of impertinence, or else as something to which its possessor has no legitimate right, and upon which he dares to pride himself, and in retaliation and revenge for his conduct, people secretly try and humiliate him in some other way, and if they wait to do this, it is only for a fitting opportunity. A man may be as humble as possible in his demeanor, and yet hardly ever get people to overlook his crime in standing intellectually above them. In the Garden of Roses, Sadi makes the remark, "You should know that foolish people are 100-fold more averse to meeting the wise than the wise are indisposed for the company of the foolish." On the other hand, it is a real recommendation to be stupid, for just as warmth is agreeable to the body, so it does the mind good to feel its superiority, and a man will seek company likely to give him this feeling, as instinctively as he will approach the fireplace or walk in the sun if he wants to get warm. But this means that he will be disliked on account of his superiority, and if a man is to be liked, he must really be inferior in point of intellect, and the same thing holds good of a woman in point of beauty. To give proof of real and unfeigned inferiority to some of the people you meet, that is a very difficult business indeed. Consider how kindly and heartily a girl who is passably pretty will welcome one who is downright ugly. Physical advantages are not thought so much of in the case of man, though I suppose you would rather a little man sat next to you than one who was bigger than yourself. This is why, amongst men, it is the dull and ignorant, and amongst women, the ugly, who are always popular and in request. It is likely to be said of such people that they are extremely good-natured, because everyone wants to find a pretext for caring about them, a pretext which will blind both himself and other people to the real reason why he likes them. This is also why mental superiority of any sort always tends to isolate its possessor. People run away from him out of pure hatred, and say all manner of bad things about him by way of justifying their action. Beauty, in the case of women, has a similar effect. Very pretty girls have no friends of their own sex, and they even find it hard to get another girl to keep them company. A handsome woman should always avoid applying for a position as companion, because the moment she enters the room, her prospective mistress will scowl at her beauty as a piece of folly with which, both for her own and for her daughter's sake, she can very well dispense. But if the girl has advantages of rank, the case is very different, because rank, unlike personal qualities which work by the force of mere contrast, produces its effect by a process of reflection, much in the same way as the particular hue of a person's complexion depends upon the prevailing tone of his immediate surroundings. These remarks are applicable not only to advancement in political life, but to all competition for places of honor and dignity, nay, even for reputation in the world of science, literature, and art. In learned societies, for example, mediocrity, that very acceptable quality, is always to the fore, whilst merit meets with tardy recognition, or with none at all. So it is in everything. Section 35. Our trust in other people, often consists in great measure of pure laziness, selfishness, and vanity on our own part. I say laziness because, instead of making inquiries ourselves and exercising an active care, we prefer to trust others. Selfishness because we are led to confide in people by the pressure of our own affairs, and vanity when we ask confidence for a matter on which we rather pride ourselves. And yet, for all that, we expect people to be true to the trust we repose in them. But we ought not to become angry if people put no trust in us, because that really means that they pay honesty the sincere compliment of regarding it as a very rare thing, so rare indeed as to leave us in doubt whether its existence is not merely fabulous. Section 36. Politeness, which the Chinese hold to be a cardinal virtue, is based upon two considerations of policy. I have explained one of these considerations in my Ethics. The other is as follows. Politeness is a tacit agreement that people's miserable defects, whether moral or intellectual, shall on either side be ignored and not made the subject of reproach. And since these defects are thus rendered somewhat less obtrusive, the result is mutually advantageous. It is a wise thing to be polite. Consequently, it is a stupid thing to be rude. To make enemies by unnecessary and willful incivility is just as insane a proceeding as to set your house on fire, for politeness is like a counter, an avowedly false coin, with which it is foolish to be stingy. A sensible man will be generous in the use of it. It is customary in every country to end a letter with the words, "Your most obedient servant." The Germans are the only people who suppress the word servant, Diener, because, of course, it is not true. However, to carry politeness to such an extent as to damage your prospects is like giving money where only counters are expected. Wax, a substance naturally hard and brittle, can be made soft by the application of a little warmth, so that it will take any shape you please. In the same way, by being polite and friendly, you can make people pliable and obliging, even though they are apt to be crabbed and malevolent. Hence, politeness is to human nature what warmth is to wax. Of course, it is no easy matter to be polite. In so far, I mean, as it requires us to show great respect for everybody, whereas most people deserve none at all. And again, in so far as it demands that we should feign the most lively interest in people, when we must be very glad that we have nothing to do with them. To combine politeness with pride is a masterpiece of wisdom. We should be much less ready to lose our temper over an insult, which, in the strict sense of the word, means that we have not been treated with respect, if, on the one hand, we have not such an exaggerated estimate of our value and dignity. That is to say, if we were not so immensely proud of ourselves, and, on the other hand, if we had arrived at any clear notion of the judgment which, in his heart, one man generally passes upon another. If most people resent the slightest hint that any blame attaches to them, you may imagine their feelings if they were to overhear what their acquaintance say about them. You should never lose sight of the fact that ordinary politeness is only a grinning mask. If it shifts its place a little, or is removed for a moment, there is no use raising a hue and a cry. When a man is downright rude, it is as though he had taken off all his clothes, and stood before you in puris naturalibus. Like most men in this condition, he does not present a very attractive appearance. Section 37. You ought never to take any man as a model for what you should do or leave undone, because position and circumstances are in no two cases alike, and difference of character gives a peculiar, individual tone to what a man does. Hence, duo cum faciunt idem, non est idem. Two persons may do the same thing with a different result. A man should act in accordance with his own character, as soon as he has carefully deliberated on what he is about to do. The outcome of this is that originality cannot be dispensed with in practical matters. Otherwise, what a man does will not accord with what he is. Section 38. Never combat any man's opinion, for though you reached the age of Methuselah, you would never have done setting him right upon all the absurd things that he believes. It is also well to avoid correcting people's mistakes in conversation, however good your intentions may be, for it is easy to offend people, and difficult, if not impossible, to mend them. If you feel irritated by the absurd remarks of two people whose conversation you happen to overhear, you should imagine that you are listening to a dialogue of two fools in a comedy. Probatum est. The man who comes into the world with the notion that he is really going to instruct in matters of the highest importance may thank his stars if he escapes with a whole skin. Section 39. If you want your judgment to be accepted, express it coolly and without passion. All violence has its seat in the will, and so, if your judgment is expressed with vehemence, people will consider it an effort of will, and not the outcome of knowledge, which is in its nature cold and unimpassioned. Since the will is the primary and radical element in human nature, and intellect merely supervenes as something secondary, people are more likely to believe that the opinion you express with so much vehemence is due to the excited state of your will, rather than that the excitement of the will only comes from the ardent nature of your opinion. Section 40. Even when you are fully justified in praising yourself, you should never be seduced into doing so. For vanity is so very common, and merit so very uncommon, that even if a man appears to be praising himself, though very indirectly, people will be ready to lay 100 to 1 that he is talking out of pure vanity, and that he has not sense enough to see what a fool he is making of himself. Still, for all that, there may be some truth in Bacon's remark that, as in the case of calumny, if you throw enough dirt, some of it will stick. So it is also in regard to self-praise, with the conclusion that self-praise, in small doses, is to be recommended. Section 41. If you have reason to suspect that a person is telling you a lie, look as though you believed every word he said. This will give him the courage to go on. He will become more vehement in his assertions and in the end betray himself. Again, if you perceive that a person is trying to conceal something from you, but with only partial success, look as though you did not believe him. This opposition on your part will provoke him into leading out his reserve of truth and bringing the whole force of it to bear upon your incredulity. Section 42. You should regard all your private affairs as secrets, and in respect of them, treat your acquaintances, even though you may be on good terms with them, as perfect strangers, letting them know nothing more than they can see for themselves. For in the course of time, and under altered circumstances, you may find it a disadvantage that they know even the most harmless things about you. And, as a general rule, it is more advisable to show your intelligence by saying nothing than by speaking out. For silence is a matter of prudence, whilst speech has something in it of vanity. The opportunities for displaying the one or the other quality occur equally often, but the fleeting satisfaction afforded by speech is often preferred to the permanent advantage secured by silence. The feeling of relief which lively people experience in speaking aloud when no one is listening should not be indulged, lest it grow into a habit, for in this way thought establishes such very friendly terms with speech that conversation is apt to become a process of thinking aloud. Prudence exacts that a wide gulf should be fixed between what we think and what we say. At times we fancy that people are utterly unable to believe in the truth of some statement affecting us personally, whereas it never occurs to them to doubt it. But if we give them the slightest opportunity of doubting it, they find it absolutely impossible to believe it any more. We often betray ourselves into revealing something, simply because we suppose that people cannot help noticing it, just as a man will throw himself down from a great height because he loses his head. In other words, because he fancies that he cannot retain a firm footing any longer. The torment of his position is so great that he thinks it better to put an end to it at once. This is the kind of insanity which is called acrophobia. But it should not be forgotten how clever people are in regard to affairs which do not concern them, even though they show no particularly sign of acuteness in other matters. This is a kind of algebra in which people are very proficient. Give them a single fact to go upon, and they will solve the most complicated problems. So, if you wish to relate some event that happened long ago, without mentioning any names, or otherwise indicating the persons to whom you refer, you should be very careful not to introduce into your narrative anything that might point, however distantly, to some definite fact, whether it is a particular locality or a date, or the name of someone who was only to a small extent implicated, or anything else that was even remotely connected with the event, for that at once gives people something positive to go upon, and by the aid of their talent for this sort of algebra, they will discover all the rest. Their curiosity in these matters becomes a kind of enthusiasm. Their will spurs on their intellect, and drives it forward to the attainment of the most remote results. For, however unsusceptible and different people may be to general and universal truth, they are very ardent in the matter of particular details. In keeping with what I have said, it will be found that all those who profess to give instructions in the wisdom of life are specially urgent in commending the practice of silence, and assign manifold reasons why it should be observed, so it is not necessary for me to enlarge upon the subject any further. However, I may add just one or two little-known Arabian proverbs, which occur to me as particularly appropriate. Do not tell a friend anything that you would conceal from an enemy. A secret is in my custody, if I keep it, but should it escape me, it is I who am the prisoner. The tree of silence bears the fruit of peace. Section 43. Money is never spent to so much advantage as when you have been cheated out of it, for at one stroke you have purchased prudence. Section 44. If possible, no animosity should be felt for anyone, but carefully observe and remember the manner in which a man conducts himself, so that you may take the measure of his value, at any rate in regard to yourself, and regulate your bearing towards him accordingly, never losing sight of the fact that character is unalterable, and that to forget the bad features in a man's disposition is like throwing away hard-won money. Thus you will protect yourself against the results of unwise intimacy and foolish friendship. Give way neither to love nor to hate is one half of worldly wisdom. Say nothing and believe nothing is the other half. Truly, a world where there is such need of rules as this and the following is one upon which a man may well turn his back. Section 45. To speak angrily to a person, to show your hatred by what you say or by the way you look, is an unnecessary proceeding, dangerous, foolish, ridiculous, and vulgar. Anger and hatred should never be shown otherwise than in what you do, and feelings will be all the more effective in action, in so far as you avoid the exhibition of them in any other way. It is only cold-blooded animals whose bite is poisonous. Section 46. To speak without emphasizing your words, parler sans accent, is an old rule with those who are wise in the world's ways. It means that you should leave other people to discover what it is that you have said, and as their minds are slow, you can make your escape in time. On the other hand, to emphasize your meaning is to address their feelings, and the result is always the opposite of what you expect. If you are polite enough in your manner and courteous in your tone, there are many people whom you may abuse outright, and yet run no immediate risk of offending them. Chapter 4. Worldly Fortune. Section 47. However varied the forms that human destiny may take, the same elements are always present, and so life is everywhere much of a piece, whether it passed in the cottage or in the palace, in the barrack or in the cloister. Alter the circumstance as much as you please. point to strange adventures, successes, failures. Life is like a sweet shop, where there is a great variety of things, odd in shape and diverse in color, but one and all are made from the same paste. And when men speak of someone's success, the lot of the man who has failed is not so very different as it seems. The inequalities in the world are like the combinations in a kaleidoscope. At every turn a fresh picture strikes the eye, and yet in reality you only see the same bits of glass as you saw before. Section 48. An ancient writer says, very truly, that there are 3 great powers in the world: sagacity, strength, and luck. I think the last is the most efficacious. A man's life is like the voyage of a ship, where luck, secunda aut adversa fortuna, acts the part of the wind, and speeds the vessel on its way or drives it far out of its course. All that the man can do for himself is of little avail, like the rudder, which, if worked hard and continuously, may help in the navigation of the ship, and yet all may be lost again by a sudden squall. But if the wind is only in the right quarter, the ship will sail on so as not to need any steering. The power of luck is nowhere better expressed than in a certain Spanish proverb, "Daventura a tu hijo, y échalo en el mar." Give your son luck and throw him into the sea. Still, chance, it may be said, is a malignant power, and as little as possible should be left to its agency. And yet where is there any giver who, in dispensing gifts, tells us quite clearly that we have no right to them, and that we owe them not to any merit on our part, but wholly to the goodness and grace of the giver, at the same time allowing us to cherish the joyful hope of receiving, in all humility, further undeserved gifts from the same hands? Is there any giver like that, unless it be chance? Who understands the kingly art of showing the recipient that all merit is powerless and unavailing against the royal grace and favor? On looking back over the course of his life, that labyrinthine way of error, a man must see many points where luck failed him and misfortune came. And then it is easy to carry self-reproach to an unjust excess. For the course of a man's life is in no wise entirely of his own making. It is the product of 2 factors: the series of things that happened, and his own resolves in regard to them. And these 2 are constantly interacting upon and modifying each other. And besides these, another influence is at work in the very limited extent of a man's horizon, whether it is that he cannot see very far ahead in respect of the plans he will adopt, or that he is still less able to predict the course of future events. His knowledge is strictly confined to present plans and present events. Hence, as long as a man's goal is far off, he cannot steer straight for it. He must be content to make a course that is approximately right, and in following the direction in which he thinks he ought to go, he will often have occasion to tack. All that a man can do is to form such resolves as from time to time accord with the circumstances in which he is placed, in the hope of thus managing to advance a step nearer towards the final goal. It is usually the case that the position in which we stand and the object at which we aim resemble 2 tendencies working with dissimilar strength in different directions, and the course of our life is represented by their diagonal or resultant force. Terence makes the remark that life is like a game at dice, where if the number that turns up is not precisely the one you want, you can still contrive to use it equally. Or, to put the matter more shortly, life is a game of cards, when the cards are shuffled and dealt by fate. But, for my present purpose, the most suitable simile would be that of a game of chess, where the plan we determine to follow is conditioned by the play of our rival. In life, by the caprice of fate. We are compelled to modify our tactics, often to such an extent that, as we carry them out, hardly a single feature of the original plan can be recognized. But, above and beyond all this, there is another influence that makes itself felt in our lives. It is a trite saying, only too frequently true, that we are often more foolish than we think. On the other hand, we are often wiser than we fancy ourselves to be. This, however, is a discovery which only those can make, of whom it is really true, and it takes them a long time to make it. Our brains are not the wisest part of us. In the great moments of life, when a man decides upon an important step, his action is directed not so much by any clear knowledge of the right thing to do, as by an inner impulse, you may almost call it an instinct, proceeding from the deepest foundations of his being. If, later on, he attempts to criticize his action by the light of hard and fast ideas of what is right in the abstract, those unprofitable ideas which are learnt by rote, or it may be borrowed from other people, if he begins to apply general rules, the principles which have guided others, to his own case, without sufficiently weighing the maxim that one man's meat is another's poison, then he will run great risk of doing himself an injustice. The result will show where the right course lay. It is only when a man has reached the happy age of wisdom that he is capable of just judgment in regard either to his own actions or to those of others. It may be that this impulse or instinct is the unconscious effect of a kind of prophetic dream which is forgotten when we awake, lending our life a uniformity of tone, a dramatic unity such as could never result from the unstable moments of consciousness, when we are so easily led into error, and so liable to strike a false note. It is in virtue of some such prophetic dream that a man feels himself called to great achievements in a special sphere, and works in that direction from his youth up, out of an inner and secret feeling that that is his true path, just as by a similar instinct the bee is led to build up its cells in the comb. This is the impulse which Balthazar Gracian calls la gran syndaresis, the great power of moral discernment. It is something that a man instinctively feels to be his salvation, without which we are lost. To act in accordance with abstract principles is a difficult matter, and a great deal of practice will be required before you can even occasionally be successful. It often happens that the principles do not fit in with your particular case, but every man has certain innate concrete principles, a part, as it were, of the very blood that flows in his veins, the sum or result, in fact, of all his thoughts, feelings, and volitions. Usually, he has no knowledge of them in any abstract form. It is only when he looks back upon the course his life has taken that he becomes aware of having been always led on by them, as though they formed an invisible clue which he had followed unaware. Section 49. That time works great changes, and that all things are in their nature fleeting, these are truths that should never be forgotten. Hence, in whatever case you may be, it is well to picture to yourself the opposite. In prosperity, be mindful of misfortune. In friendship, of enmity. In good weather, of days when the sky is overcast. In love, of hatred. In moments of trust, to imagine the betrayal that will make you regret your confidence. And so too, when you are in an evil plight, to have a lively sense of happier times. What a lasting source of true worldly wisdom were there! We should then always reflect, and not be so very easily deceived, because in general we should anticipate the very changes that the years will bring. Perhaps in no form of knowledge is personal experience so indispensable as in learning to see that all things are unstable and transitory in this world. There is nothing that, in its own place and for the time it lasts, is not a product of necessity, and therefore capable of being fully justified. And it is this fact that makes circumstances of every year, every month, and even of every day seem as though they might maintain their right to last to all eternity. But we know that this can never be the case, and that in a world where all is fleeting, change alone endures. He is a prudent man who is not only undeceived by apparent stability, but is able to forecast the lines upon which movement will take place. But people generally think that present circumstances will last, and that matters will go on in the future as they have done in the past. Their mistakes arise from the fact that they do not understand the cause of the things they see, causes which, unlike the effects they produce, contain in themselves the germ of future change. The effects are all that people know, and they hold fast to them on the supposition that those unknown causes, which were sufficient to bring them about, will also be able to maintain them as they are. This is a very common error, and the fact that it is common is not without its advantage, for it means that people always err in unison, and hence the calamity which results from the error affects all alike, and is therefore easy to bear. Whereas, if a philosopher makes a mistake, he is alone in his error, and so at a double disadvantage. But in saying that we should anticipate the effects of time, I mean that we should mentally forecast what they are likely to be. I do not mean that we should practically forestall them by demanding the immediate performance of promises which time alone can fulfill. The man who makes his demand will find out that there is no worse or more exacting usurer than time, and that, if you compel time to give money in advance, you will have to pay a rate of interest more ruinous than any Jew would require. It is possible, for instance, to make a tree burst forth into leaf, blossom, or even bear fruit within a few days by the application of unslaked lime and artificial heat, but after that the tree will wither away. Similarly, a young man may abuse his strength. It may be for only a few weeks, by trying to do at 19 what he could easily manage at 30, and time may give him the loan for which he asks, but the interest he will have to pay comes out of the strength of his later years. Nay, it is part of his very life itself. There are some kinds of illness in which entire restoration to health is possible only by letting the complaint run its natural course, after which it disappears without leaving any trace of its existence. But if the sufferer is very impatient, and, while he is still affected, insists that he is completely well, in this case too time will grant the loan, and the complaint may be shaken off, but lifelong weakness and chronic mischief will be the interest paid upon it. Again, in time of war or general disturbance, a man may require ready money at once, and have to sell out his investments in land or consols for a third or even still smaller fraction of the sum he would have received from them if he could have waited for the market to right itself, which would have happened in due course. But he compels time to grant him the loan, and his loss is the interest he has to pay. Or perhaps he wants to go on a long journey and requires the money. In 1 or 2 years he could lay by a sufficient sum out of his income, but he cannot afford to wait, and so he either borrows it or deducts it from his capital. In other words, he gets time to lend him the money in advance. The interest he pays is a disordered state of his accounts, and permanent and increasing deficits which he can never make good. Such is time's usury, and all who cannot wait are its victims. There is no more thriftless proceeding than to try and mend the measured pace of time. Be careful, then, not to become its debtor. Section 50. In the daily affairs of life, you will have very many opportunities of recognizing a characteristic difference between ordinary people of prudence and discretion. In estimating the possibility of danger in connection with any undertaking, an ordinary man will confine his inquiries to the kind of risk that has already attended such undertakings in the past, whereas a prudent person will look ahead and consider everything that might possibly happen in the future, having regard to a certain Spanish maxim: a thing may not happen in a year, and yet may happen within 2 minutes. The difference in question is, of course, quite natural, for it requires some amount of discernment to calculate possibilities. But a man need only have his senses about him to see what has already happened. Do not admit to sacrifice to evil spirits. What I mean is that a man should not hesitate about spending time, trouble, and money, or giving up his comfort, or restricting his aims and denying himself, if he can thereby shut the door on the possibility of misfortune. The most terrible misfortunes are also the most improbable and remote, the least likely to occur. The rule I am giving is best exemplified in the practice of insurance, a public sacrifice made on the altar of anxiety. Therefore, take out your policy of insurance. Section 51. Whatever fate befalls you, do not give way to great rejoicing or great lamentation, partly because all things are full of change, and your fortune may turn at any moment, partly because men are so apt to be deceived in their judgment as to what is good or bad for them. Almost everyone, in his turn, has lamented over something which afterward turned out to be the very best thing for him that could have happened, or rejoiced at an event which became the source of his greatest sufferings. The right state of mind has been finely portrayed by Shakespeare. I have felt so many quirks of joy and grief, that the first face of either, on the start, can woman me unto't. All's well that ends well, Act 2, Scene 2. And, in general, it may be said that if a man takes misfortunes quietly, it is because he knows that very many dreadful things may happen in the course of life, and so he looks upon the trouble of the moment as only a very small part of that which might come. This is the Stoic temper, never to be unmindful of the sad fate of humanity, but always to remember that our existence is full of woe and misery, and that the ills to which we are exposed are innumerable. Wherever he be, a man need only cast a look around to revive the sense of human misery. There, before his eyes, he can see mankind struggling and floundering in torment, and all for the sake of a wretched existence, barren and unprofitable. If he remembers this, a man will not expect very much from life, but learn to accommodate himself to a world where all is relative and no perfect state exists, always looking misfortune in the face, and, if he cannot avoid it, meeting it with courage. It should never be forgotten that misfortune, be it great or small, is the element in which we live, but that is no reason why a man should indulge in fretful complaints, and, like Beresford, pull a long face over the miseries of human life. And not a single hour is free from them, or still less, call upon the deity at every flea bite. Our aim should be to look well about us, to ward off misfortune by going to meet it, to attain such perfection and refinement in averting the disagreeable things of life, whether they come from our fellow man or from the physical world, that, like a clever fox, we may slip out of the way of every mishap, great or small, remembering that a mishap is generally only our own awkwardness in disguise. The main reason why misfortune falls less heavily upon us, if we have looked upon its occurrence as not impossible, and, as the saying is, prepared ourselves for it, may be this. If, before this misfortune comes, we have quietly thought over it as something which may or may not happen, the whole of its extent and range is known to us, and we can, at least, determine how far it will affect us, so that if it really arrives it does not depress us unduly. Its weight is not felt to be greater than it actually is. But if no preparation has been made to meet it, and it comes unexpectedly, the mind is in a state of terror for the moment, and unable to measure the full extent of the calamity. It seems so far-reaching in its effects that the victim might well think that there was no limit to them. In any case, its range is exaggerated. In the same way, darkness and uncertainty always increase the sense of danger. And, of course, if we have thought over the possibility of misfortune, we have also at the same time considered the sources to which we shall look for help and consolation, or at any rate we have accustomed ourselves to the idea of it. There is nothing that better fits us to endure the misfortunes of life with composure than to know for certain that everything that happens, from the smallest up to the greatest facts of existence, happens of necessity. A man soon accommodates himself to the inevitable, to something that must be, and if he knows that nothing can happen except of necessity, he will see that things cannot be other than they are, and that even the strangest chances in the world are just as much a product of necessity as phenomena which obey well-known rules and turn out exactly in accordance with expectation. Let me here refer to what I have said elsewhere on the soothing effect of the knowledge that all things are inevitable and a product of necessity. If a man is steeped in the knowledge of this truth, he will, first of all, do what he can, and then readily endure what he must. We may regard the petty vexations of life that are constantly happening as designed to keep us in practice for bearing great misfortunes, so that we may not become completely enervated by a career of prosperity. A man should be as Siegfried, armed cap a pie towards the small troubles of every day, those little differences we have with our fellow men, insignificant disputes, unbecoming conduct in other people, petty gossip, and many other similar annoyances of life. He should not feel them at all, much less take them to heart and brood over them, but hold them at arm's length and push them out of his way, like stones that lie in the road, and upon no account think about them, and give them a place in his reflections. Section 52. What people commonly call fate is, as a general rule, nothing but their own stupid and foolish conduct. There is a fine passage in Homer illustrating the truth of this remark, where the poet praises shrewd counsel, and his advice is worthy of all attention. For if wickedness is atoned for only in another world, stupidity gets its reward here, although, now and then, mercy may be shown to the offender. It is not ferocity, but cunning, that strikes fear into the heart and forebodes danger. So true it is that the human brain is a more terrible weapon than the lion's paw. The most finished man of the world would be one who was never irresolute and never in a hurry. Section 53. Courage comes next to prudence as a quality of mind very essential to happiness. It is quite true that no one can endow himself with either, since a man inherits prudence from his mother and courage from his father. Still, if he has these qualities, he can do much to develop them by means of resolute exercise. In this world, where the game is played with loaded dice, a man must have a temper of iron, with armor proof to the blows of fate, and weapons to make his way against men. Life is one long battle. We have to fight at every step, and Voltaire very rightly says that if we succeed, it is at the point of the sword, and that we die with the weapon in our hand. It is a cowardly soul that shrinks or grows faint and despondent as soon as the storm begins to gather, or even when the first cloud appears on the horizon. Our motto should be no surrender, and far from yielding to the ills of life, let us take fresh courage from misfortune. As long as the issue of any matter is fraught with peril is still in doubt, and there is some possibility left that all may come right, no one should ever tremble or think of anything but resistance, just as a man should not despair of the weather if he can see a bit of blue sky anywhere. Let our attitude be such that we should not quake even if the world fell in ruins about us. Our whole life itself, let alone its blessings, would not be worth such a cowardly trembling and shrinking of the heart. Therefore, let us face life courageously and show a firm front to every ill. Still, it is possible for courage to be carried to an excess and to degenerate into rashness. It may even be said that some amount of fear is necessary, if we are to exist at all in the world, and cowardice is only the exaggerated form of it. This truth has been very well expressed by Bacon in his account of terror panicus, and the etymological account which he gives of its meaning is very superior to the ancient explanation preserved for us by Plutarch. He connects the expression with Pan, the personification of nature, and observes that fear is innate in every living thing, and in fact tends to its preservation, but that it is apt to come into play without due cause, and that man is especially exposed to it. The chief feature of this panic terror is that there is no clear notion of any definite danger bound up with it, that it presumes rather than knows that danger exists, and that, in the case of need, it pleads fright itself as the reason for being afraid. Chapter 5. The Ages of Life. There is a very fine saying of Voltaire's to the effect that every age of life has its own peculiar mental character, and that a man will feel completely unhappy if his mind is not in accordance with his years. It will, therefore, be a fitting close to our speculations upon the nature of happiness if we glance at the chances which the various periods of life produce in us. Our whole life long it is the present, and the present alone, that we actually possess. The only difference is that at the beginning of life we look forward to a long future, and that towards the end we look back upon a long past, and also that our temperament, but not our character, undergoes certain well-known changes, which make the present wear a different color at each period of life. I have elsewhere stated that in childhood we are more given to using our intellect than our will, and I have explained why this is so. It is just for this reason that the first quarter of life is so happy. As we look back upon it in after years, it seems a sort of lost paradise. In childhood, our relations with others are limited, our wants are few. In a word, there is little stimulus for the will, and so our chief concern is the extension of our knowledge. The intellect, like the brain, which attains its full size in the 7th year, is developed early, though it takes time to mature, and it explores the whole world of its surroundings in its constant search for nutriment. It is then that existence is in itself an ever-fresh delight, and all things sparkle with the charm of novelty. This is why the years of childhood are like a long poem, for the function of poetry, as of all art, is to grasp the idea, in the Platonic sense. In other words, to apprehend a particular object in such a way as to perceive its essential nature, the characteristics it has in common with all other objects of the same kind, so that a single object appears as the representative of a class, and the result of one experience holds good for 1,000. It may be thought that my remarks are opposed to fact, and that the child is never occupied with anything beyond the individual objects or events which are presented to it from time to time, and then only in so far as they interest and excite its will for the moment. But this is not really the case. In those early years, life, in the full meaning of the word, is something so new and fresh, and its sensations are so keen and unblunted by repetition that, in the midst of all its pursuits, and without any clear consciousness of what it is doing, the child is always silently occupied in grasping the nature of life itself, in arriving at its fundamental character and general outline by means of separate scenes and experiences. Or, to use Spinoza's phraseology, the child is learning to see things and persons about it sub specie aeternitatis, as particular manifestations of universal law. The younger we are, then, the more does every individual object represent for us the whole class to which it belongs. But as the years increase, this becomes less and less the case. That is the reason why youthful impressions are so different from those of old age, and that is also why the slight knowledge and experience gained in childhood and youth afterwards come to stand as the permanent rubric, or heading, for all the knowledge acquired in later life. Those early forms of knowledge pass into categories, as it were, under which the results of subsequent experience are classified, though a clear consciousness of what is being done does not always attend upon the process. In this way, the earliest years of a man's life lay the foundation of his view of the world, whether it be shallow or deep, and although this view may be extended and perfected later on, it is not materially altered. It is an effect of this purely objective and therefore poetical view of the world, essential to the period of childhood and promoted by the as yet undeveloped state of the volitional energy, that, as children, we are concerned much more with the acquisition of pure knowledge than with exercising the power of the will. Hence that grave, fixed look observable in so many children, of which Raphael makes such a happy use in his depiction of cherubs, especially in the picture of the Sistine Madonna. The years of childhood are thus rendered so full of bliss that the memory of them is always coupled with longing and regret. While we thus eagerly apply ourselves to learning the outward aspect of things, as the primitive method of understanding the objects about us, education aims at instilling into us ideas. But ideas furnish no information as to the real and essential nature of objects, which, as the foundation and true content of all knowledge, can be reached only by the process called intuition. This is a kind of knowledge which can in no wise be instilled into us from without. We must arrive at it by and for ourselves. Hence, a man's intellectual as well as his moral qualities proceed from the depths of his own nature, and are not the result of external influences, and no educational scheme of Pestalozzi or of anyone else can turn a born simpleton into a man of sense. The thing is impossible. He was born a simpleton, and a simpleton he will die. It is the depth and intensity of this early intuitive knowledge of the external world that explains why the experiences of childhood take such a firm hold on the memory. When we were young, we were completely absorbed in our immediate surroundings. There was nothing to distract our attention from them. We looked upon the objects about us as though they were the only ones of their kind, as though, indeed, nothing else existed at all. Later on, when we come to find out how many things there are in the world, this primitive state of mind vanishes, and with it our patience. I have said elsewhere that the world, considered as object, in other words, as it is presented to us objectively, wears in general a pleasing aspect, but that in the world considered as subject, that is, in regards to its inner nature, which is will, pain and trouble predominate. I may be allowed to express the matter briefly thus. The world is glorious to look at, but dreadful in reality. Accordingly, we find that, in the years of childhood, the world is much better known to us on its outer or objective side, namely as the presentation of the will, than on the side of the inner nature, namely as the will itself. Since the objective side wears a pleasing aspect, and the inner or subjective side, with its tale of horror, remains as yet unknown, the youth, as his intelligence develops, takes all the forms of beauty that he sees, in nature and in art, for so many objects of blissful existence. They are so beautiful to the outward eye that, on their inner side, they must, he thinks, be much more beautiful still. So the world lies before him like another Eden, and this is the Arcadia in which we are all born. A little later, this state of mind gives birth to a thirst for real life, the impulse to do and to suffer, which drives a man forth into the hurly-burly of the world. There he learns the other side of existence, the inner side, the will, which is thwarted at every step. Then comes the great period of disillusion, a period of very gradual growth. But once it has fairly begun, A man will tell you that he has got over all his false notions, and yet the process is only beginning, and it goes on extending its sway and applying more and more to the whole of life. So it may be said that in childhood, life looks like the scenery in a theater, as you view it from a distance, and that in old age it is like the same scenery when you come up quite close to it. And lastly, there is another circumstance that contributes to the happiness of childhood. As spring commences, the young leaves on the trees are similar in color and much the same in shape, and in the first years of life we all resemble one another and harmonize very well. But with puberty, divergence begins, and like the radii of a circle, we go further and further apart. The period of youth, which forms the remainder of this earlier half of our existence, and how many advantages it has over the latter half, is troubled and made miserable by the pursuit of happiness, as though there were no doubt that it can be met with somewhere in life, a hope that always ends in failure and leads to discontent, an illusory image of some vague future bliss, born of a dream and shaped by fancy, floats before our eyes, and we search for the reality in vain. So it is that the young man is generally dissatisfied with the position in which he finds himself, whatever it may be. He ascribes his disappointment solely to the state of things that meet him on his first introduction to life, when he had expected something very different, whereas it is only the vanity and wretchedness of human life everywhere that he is now for the first time experiencing. It would be a great advantage to a young man if his early training could eradicate the idea that the world has a great deal to offer him. But the usual result of education is to strengthen this delusion, and our first ideas of life are generally taken from fiction rather than from fact. In the bright dawn of our youthful days, the poetry of life spreads out a gorgeous vision before us, and we torture ourselves by longing to see it realized. We might as well wish to grasp the rainbow. The youth expects his career to be like an interesting romance, and there lies the germ of that disappointment which I have been describing. What lends a charm to all these visions is just the fact that they are visionary and not real, and that in contemplating them we are in the sphere of pure knowledge, which is sufficient in itself and free from the noise and struggle of life. To try and realize those visions is to make them an object of will, a process which always involves pain. If the chief feature of the earlier half of life is a never-satisfied longing after happiness, the later half is characterized by the dread of misfortune. For, as we advance in years, it becomes in a greater or less degree clear that all happiness is chimerical in its nature, and that pain alone is real. Accordingly, in later years, we, or at least the more prudent amongst us, are more intent upon eliminating what is painful from our lives and making our position secure than on the pursuit of positive pleasure. I may observe, by the way, that in old age we are better able to prevent misfortunes from coming, and in youth better able to bear them when they come. In my young days I was always pleased to hear a ring at my door. Ah, thought I, now for something pleasant. But in later life my feelings on such occasions were rather akin to dismay than to pleasure. Heaven help me, I thought. What am I to do? A similar revulsion of feeling in regard to the world of men takes place in all persons of any talent or distinction. For that very reason they cannot be said properly to belong to the world. In a greater or less degree, according to the extent of their superiority, they stand alone. In their youth they have a sense of being abandoned by the world, but later on they feel as though they had escaped it. The earlier feeling is an unpleasant one, and rests upon ignorance. The second is pleasurable, for in the meantime they have come to know what the world is. The consequence of this is that, as compared with the earlier, the later half of life, like the second part of a musical period, has less of passionate longing and more restfulness about it. And why is this the case? Simply because, in youth, a man fancies that there is a prodigious amount of happiness and pleasure to be had in the world, only that it is difficult to come by. Whereas, when he becomes old, he knows that there is nothing of the kind. He makes his mind completely at ease on the matter, enjoys the present hour as well as he can, and even takes a pleasure in trifles. The chief result gained by experience of life is clearness of view. This is what distinguishes the man of mature age, and makes the world wear such a different aspect from that which it presented in his youth or boyhood. It is only then that he sees things quite plain, and takes them for that which they really are. So, while in earlier years he saw a phantom world, put together out of the whims and crotchets of his own mind, inherited prejudice and strange delusion, the real world was hidden from him, or the vision of it was distorted. The first thing that experience finds to do is to free us from the phantoms of the brain, those false notions that have been put into us in youth. To prevent their entrance at all would, of course, be the best form of education, even though it were only negative in aim, but it would be a task full of difficulty. At first, the child's horizon would have to be limited as much as possible, and yet within that limited sphere none but clear and correct notions would have to be given. Only after the child had properly appreciated everything within it might the sphere be gradually enlarged, care being always taken that nothing was left obscure, or half or wrongly understood. The consequence of this training would be that the child's notions of men and things would always be limited and simple in their character, but on the other hand they would be clear and correct, and only need to be extended and not to be rectified. The same line might be pursued on into the period of youth. This method of education would lay special stress upon the prohibition of novel reading, and the place of novels would be taken by suitable biographical literature, the life of Franklin, for instance, or Moritz Anton Reiser. In our early days, we fancy that the leading events in our life, and the persons who are going to play an important part in it, will make their entrance to the sound of drums and trumpets. But when, in old age, we look back, we find that they all came in quite quietly, slipped in, as it were, by the side door, almost unnoticed. From the point of view we have been taking up until now, life may be compared to a piece of embroidery, of which, during the first half of his time, a man gets a sight of the right side, and during the second half of the wrong. The wrong side is not so pretty as the right, but it is more instructive. It shows the way in which the threads have been worked together. Intellectual superiority, even if it is of the highest kind, will not secure for a man a preponderating place in conversation until after he is 40 years of age. For age and experience, though they can never be a substitute for intellectual talent, may far outweigh it, and even in a person of the meanest capacity, they give a certain counterpoise to the power of an extremely intellectual man, so long as the latter is young. Of course, I allude here to personal superiority, not to the place a man may gain by his works. And on passing his 40th year, any man of the slightest power of mind, any man, that is, who has more than the sorry share of intellect with which nature has endowed 5/6 of mankind, will hardly fail to show some trace of misanthropy. For, as is natural, he has by that time inferred other people's character from an examination of his own, with the result that he has been gradually disappointed to find that in the qualities of the head, or in those of the heart, and usually in both, he reaches a level to which they do not attain, so he gladly avoids having anything more to do with them. For it may be said in general that every man will love or hate solitude, in other words, his own society, just in proportion as he is worth anything in himself. Kant has some remarks upon this kind of misanthropy in his critique of the faculty of judgment. In a young man, it is a bad sign, as well from an intellectual as from a moral point of view, if he is precocious in understanding the ways of the world, and in adapting himself to its pursuits. If he at once knows how to deal with men, and enters upon life, as it were, fully prepared. It argues a vulgar nature. On the other hand, to be surprised and astonished at the way that people act, and to be clumsy and cross-grained in having to do with them, indicates a character of the nobler sort. The cheerfulness and vivacity of youth are partly due to the fact that, when we are ascending the hill of life, death is not visible. It lies down at the bottom of the other side. But once we have crossed the top of the hill, death comes into view. Death, which until then was known to us only by hearsay. This makes our spirits droop, for at the same time we begin to feel that our vital powers are on the ebb. A grave seriousness now takes the place of that early extravagance of spirit, and the change is noticeable even in the expression of a man's face. As long as we were young, people may tell us what they please. We look upon life as endless and use our time recklessly. But the older we become, the more we practice economy, for towards the close of life, every day we live gives us the same kind of sensation as the criminal experiences at every step on his way to be tried. From the standpoint of youth, life seems to stretch away into an endless future. From the standpoint of old age, to go back but a little way into the past, so that, at the beginning, life presents us with a picture in which the objects appear a great way off, as though we had reversed our telescope, while in the end everything seems so close. To see how short life is, a man must have grown old, and that is to say, he must have lived long. On the other hand, as the years increase, things look smaller, one and all, and life, which had so firm and stable a base in the days of our youth, now seems nothing but a rapid flight of moments, every one of them illusory. We have come to see that the whole world is vanity. Time itself seems to go at a much slower pace when we are young, so that not only is the first quarter of life the happiest, but it is also the longest of all. It leaves more memories behind it. If a man were put to it, he could tell you more out of the first quarter of his life than out of the 2 of the remaining periods. Nay, in the spring of life, as in the spring of the year, the days reach a length that is positively tiresome. But in the autumn, whether of the year or of life, though they are short, they are more genial and uniform. But why is it that to an old man his past life appears so short? For this reason, his memory is short. And so he fancies that his life has been short too. He no longer remembers the insignificant parts of it, and much that was unpleasant is now forgotten. How little, then, there is left! For, in general, a man's memory is as imperfect as his intellect, and he must make a practice of reflecting upon the lessons he has learned and the events he has experienced, if he does not want them both to sink gradually into the gulf of oblivion. Now, we are unaccustomed to reflect upon matters of no importance, or, as a rule, upon things that we have found disagreeable, and yet that is necessary if the memory of them is to be preserved. But the class of things that may be called insignificant is continually receiving fresh additions. Much that wears an air of importance at first gradually becomes of no consequence at all from the fact of its frequent repetition, so that in the end we actually lose count of the number of times it happens. Hence, we are better able to remember the events of our early than of our later years. The longer we live, the fewer are the things that we can call important or significant enough to deserve further consideration, and by this alone can they be fixed in the memory. In other words, they are forgotten as soon as they are past. Thus it is that time runs on, leaving always fewer traces of its passage. Further, if disagreeable things have happened to us, we do not care to ruminate upon them, least of all when they touch our vanity, as is usually the case, for few misfortunes fall upon us for which we can be entirely held blameless. So people are very ready to forget many things that are disagreeable, as well as many that are unimportant. It is from this double cause that our memory is so short, and a man's recollection of what has happened always becomes proportionately shorter the more things that have occupied him in life. The things that we did in years gone by, the events that happened long ago, are like those objects on the coast which, to the seafarer on his outward voyage, become smaller every minute, more unrecognizable and harder to distinguish. Again, it sometimes happens that memory and imagination will call up some long past scene as vividly as if it had occurred only yesterday, so that the event in question seems to stand very near to the present time. The reason of this is that it is impossible to call up all the intervening period in the same vivid way, as there is no one figure pervading it which can be taken in at a glance, and besides, most of the things that happened in the period are forgotten, and all that remains of it is the general knowledge that we have lived through it, a mere notion of abstract existence, and not a direct vision of some particular experience. It is this that causes some single event of long ago to appear as though it took place but yesterday. The intervening time vanishes, and the whole of life looks incredibly short. Nay, there are occasional moments in old age when we can scarcely believe that we are so advanced in years, or that the long past lying behind us has had any real existence, a feeling which is mainly due to the circumstance that the present always seems fixed and immovable as we look at it. These and similar mental phenomena are ultimately to be traced to the fact that it is not our nature in itself, but only the outward presentation of it that lies in time, and that the present is the point of contact between the world as subject and the world as object. Again, why is it that in youth we can see no end to the years that seem to lie before us? Because we are obliged to find room for all the things we hope to attain in life. We cram the years so full of projects that if we were to try and carry them all out, death would come prematurely, though we reach the age of Methuselah. Another reason why life looks so long when we are young is that we are apt to measure its length by the few years we have already lived. In those early years things are new to us, and so they appear important. We dwell upon them after they have happened and often call them to mind. And thus, in youth, life seems replete with incident, and therefore of long duration. Sometimes we credit ourselves with a longing to be in some distant spot, whereas in truth we are only longing to have the time back again which we spent there, days when we were younger and fresher than we are now. In those moments time mocks us by wearing the mask of space, and if we travel to the spot, we can see how much we have been deceived. There are two ways of reaching a great age, both of which presuppose a sound constitution as a conditio sine qua non. They may be illustrated by two lamps, one of which burns a long time with very little oil, because it has a very thin wick, and the other just as long, though it has a very thick one, because there is plenty of oil to feed it. Here, the oil is the vital energy, and the difference in the wick is the manifold way in which the vital energy is used. Up to our 36th year, we may be compared, in respect of the way in which we use our vital energies, to people who live on the interest of their money. What they spend today, they have again tomorrow. But from the age of 36 onwards, our position is like that of the investor who begins to entrench upon his capital. At first, he hardly notices any difference at all, as the greater part of his expenses is covered by the interest of his securities, and if the deficit is but slight, he pays no attention to it. But the deficit goes on increasing, until he awakes to the fact that it is becoming more serious every day. His position becomes less and less secure, and he feels himself growing poorer and poorer, while he has no expectation of this drain upon his resources coming to an end. His fall from wealth to poverty becomes faster every moment, like the fall of a solid body in space, until at last he has absolutely nothing left. A man is truly in a woeful plight if both the terms of this comparison, his vital energy and his wealth, really begin to melt away at one and the same time. It is the dread of this calamity that makes love of possession increase with age. On the other hand, at the beginning of life, in the years before we attain majority, and for some little time afterwards, the state of our vital energy puts us on a level with those who each year lay by a part of their interest and add it to their capital. In other words, not only does their interest come in regularly, but the capital is constantly receiving additions. This happy condition of affairs is sometimes brought about, with health as with money, under the watchful care of some honest guardian. O happy youth, and sad old age! Nevertheless, a man should economize his strength even when he is young. Aristotle observes that amongst those who were victors at Olympia, only 2 or 3 gained a prize at 2 different periods, once in boyhood and then again when they came to be men. And the reason of this was that the premature efforts which the training involved so completely exhausted their powers that they failed to last on into manhood. As this is true of muscular, so it is still more true of nervous energy, of which all intellectual achievements are the manifestation. Hence those infant prodigies, the fruit of a hothouse education, who surprise us by their cleverness as children, afterwards turn out to be very ordinary folk. Nay, the manner in which boys are forced into an early acquaintance with the ancient tongues may, perhaps, be to blame for the dullness and lack of judgment which distinguish so many learned persons. I have said that almost every man's character seems to be specially suited to some one period of life, so that on reaching it the man is at his best. Some people are charming so long as they are young, and afterwards there is nothing attractive about them. Others are vigorous and active in manhood, and then lose all the value they possess as they advance in years. Many appear to best advantage in old age, when their character assumes a gentler tone, as becomes men who have seen the world and take life easily. This is often the case with the French. This peculiarity must be due to the fact that the man's character has something in it akin to the qualities of youth or manhood or old age, something which accords with one or another of these periods of life, or perhaps acts as a corrective to its special failings. The mariner observes the progress he makes only by the way in which objects on the coast fade away into the distance and apparently decrease in size. In the same way, a man becomes conscious that he is advancing in years when he finds that people older than himself begin to seem young to him. It has already been remarked that the older a man becomes, the fewer are the traces left in his mind by all that he sees, does, or experiences, and the cause of this has been explained. There is thus a sense in which it may be said that it is only in youth that a man lives with a full degree of consciousness, and that he is only half alive when he is old. As the years advance, his consciousness of what goes on about him dwindles, and the things of life hurry by without making any impression upon him, just as none is made by a work of art seen for the 1000th time. A man does what his hand finds to do, and afterwards he does not know whether he has done it or not. As life becomes more and more unconscious, the nearer it approaches the point at which all consciousness ceases. The course of time itself seems to increase in rapidity. In childhood, all the things and circumstances of life are novel, and that is sufficient to awake us to the full consciousness of existence. Hence, at that age, the day seems of such immense length. The same thing happens when we are traveling. 1 month seems longer than 4 spent at home. Still, though time seems to last longer when we are young or on a journey, the sense of novelty does not prevent it from, now and then, in reality, hanging heavily upon our hands under both of these circumstances, at any rate more than is the case when we are old or staying at home. But the intellect gradually becomes so rubbed down and blunted by long habituation to such impressions that things have a constant tendency to produce less and less impression upon us as they pass by, and this makes time seem increasingly less important, and therefore shorter in duration. The hours of the boy are longer than the days of the old man. Accordingly, time goes faster and faster the longer we live, like a ball rolling down a hill. Or, to take another example, as in a revolving disc, the further a point lies from the center, the more rapid is its rate of progression. So it is in the wheel of life. The further you stand from the beginning, the faster that time moves for you. Hence, it may be said that, as far as concerns the immediate sensation that time makes upon our minds, the length of any given year is in direct proportion to the number of times it will divide our whole life. For instance, at the age of 50, the year appears to us only 1/10 as long as it did at the age of 5. This variation in the rate at which time appears to move exercises a most decided influence upon the whole nature of our existence at every period of it. First of all, it causes childhood, even though it embraces only a span of 15 years, to seem the longest period of life, and therefore the richest in reminiscences. Next, it brings it about that a man is apt to be bored just in proportion as he is young. Consider, for instance, that constant need of occupation, whether it is in work or play, that is shown by children. If they come to an end of both work and play, a terrible feeling of boredom ensues. Even in youth, people are by no means free from this tendency, and dread the hours when they have nothing to do. As manhood approaches, boredom disappears, and old men find the time too short, when their days fly past them like arrows from a bow. Of course, I must be understood to speak of men, not of decrepit brutes. With this increased rapidity of time, boredom mostly passes away as we advance in life, and as the passions with all their attendant pain are then laid asleep, the burden of life is, on the whole, appreciably lighter in later years than in youth, provided, of course, that health remains. So it is that the period immediately preceding the weakness and troubles of old age receives the name of a man's best years. That may be a true appellation, in view of the comfortable feeling which those years bring, but for all that the years of youth, when our consciousness is lively and open to every sort of impression, have this privilege, that then the seeds are sown and the buds come forth. It is the springtime of the mind. Deep truths may be perceived, but can never be excogitated. That is to say, the first knowledge of them is immediate, called forth by some momentary impression. This knowledge is of such a kind as to be attainable only when the impressions are strong, lively, and deep. And if we are to be acquainted with deep truths, then everything depends upon a proper use of our early years. In later life we may be able better to work upon other people, upon the world, because our natures are then finished and rounded off, and no more a prey to fresh views. But then the world is less able to work upon us. These are the years of action and achievement, while youth is the time for forming fundamental conceptions and laying down the groundwork of thought. In youth it is the outward aspect of things that most engages us, while in age thought or reflection is the predominating quality of the mind. Hence, youth is the time for poetry, and age is more inclined to philosophy. In practical affairs it is the same. A man shapes his resolutions in youth more by the impression that the outward world makes upon him, whereas when he is old, it is thought that determines his actions. This is partly to be explained by the fact that it is only when a man is old that the results of outward observation are present in sufficient numbers to allow of their being classified according to the ideas they represent, a process which in its turn causes those ideas to be more fully understood in all their bearings, and the exact value and amount of trust to be placed in them fixed and determined, while at the same time he has grown accustomed to the impressions produced by the various phenomena of life, and their effects on him are no longer what they were. Contrarily, in youth, the impressions that things make, that is to say, the outward aspects of life, are so overpoweringly strong, especially in the case of people of lively and imaginative disposition, that they view the world like a picture, and their chief concern is the figure they cut in it, the appearance they present. Nay, they are unaware of the extent to which this is the case. It is a quality of mind that shows itself, if in no other way, in that personal vanity and that love of fine clothes which distinguishes young people. There can be no doubt that the intellectual powers are most capable of enduring great and sustained efforts in youth, up to the age of 35 at least, from which period their strength begins to decline, though very gradually. Still, the later years of life, and even old age itself, are not without their intellectual compensation. It is only then that a man can be said to be really rich in experience or in learning. He has then had time and opportunity enough to enable him to see and think over life from all its sides. He has been able to compare one thing with another, and to discover points of contact and connecting links, so that only then are the true relations of things rightly understood. Furthermore, in old age there comes an increased depth in the knowledge that was acquired in youth. A man has now many more illustrations of any ideas he may have attained. Things which he thought he knew when he was young, he now knows in reality. And besides, his range of knowledge is wider, and in whatever direction it extends, it is thorough, and therefore formed into a consistent and connected whole, whereas in youth knowledge is always defective and fragmentary. A complete and adequate notion of life can never be attained by anyone who does not reach old age, for it is only the old man who sees life whole and knows its natural course. It is only he who is acquainted, and this is the most important, not only with its entrance, like the rest of mankind, but with its exit, too, so that he alone has a full sense of its utter vanity, whilst the others never cease to labor under the false notion that everything will come right in the end. On the other hand, there is more conceptive power in youth, and at that time of life a man can make more out of the little knowledge that he knows. In age, judgment, penetration, and thoroughness predominate. Youth is the time for amassing the material for a knowledge of the world that shall be distinctive and peculiar, for an original view of life, in other words, the legacy that a man of genius leaves to his fellow men. It is, however, only in later years that he becomes master of his material. Accordingly, it will be found that, as a rule, a great writer gives his best work to the world when he is about 50 years of age. But though the tree of knowledge must reach its full height before it can bear fruit, the roots of it lie in youth. Every generation, no matter how paltry its character, thinks itself much wiser than the one immediately preceding it, let alone those that are more remote. It is just the same with the different periods in a man's life, and yet often, in the one case no less than in the other, it is a mistaken opinion. In the years of physical growth, when our powers of mind and our stores of knowledge are receiving daily additions, it becomes a habit for today to look down with contempt upon yesterday. The habit strikes root, and remains even after the intellectual powers have begun to decline, when today should rather look up with respect to yesterday. So it is that we often unduly depreciate the achievements as well as the judgments of our youth. This seems the place for making the general observation that, although in its main qualities a man's intellect or head, as well as his character or heart, is innate, yet the former is by no means so unalterable in its nature as the latter. The fact is that the intellect is subject to very many transformations, which, as a rule, do not fail to make their actual appearance, and this is so partly because the intellect has a deep foundation in the physique, and partly because the material with which it deals is given in experience. And so, from a physical point of view, we find that if a man has any peculiar power, it first gradually increases in strength until it reaches its acme, after which it enters upon a path of slow decadence, until it ends in imbecility. But, on the other hand, we must not lose sight of the fact that the material which gives employment to a man's powers and keeps them in activity, the subject matter of thought and knowledge, experience, intellectual attainments, the practice of seeing to the bottom of things, and so a perfect mental vision, form in themselves a mass which continues to increase in size, until the time comes when weakness shows itself, and the man's powers suddenly fail. The way in which these two distinguishable elements combine in the same nature, the one absolutely unalterable, and the other subject to change in two directions opposed to each other, explains the variety of mental attitude and the dissimilarity of value which attach to a man at different periods of life. The same truth may be more broadly expressed by saying that the first 40 years of life furnish the text, while the remaining 30 supply the commentary, and that without the commentary we are unable to understand aright the true sense and coherence of the text, together with the moral it contains, and all the subtle application of which it admits. Towards the close of life, much the same thing happens as at the end of a bal masque. The masks are taken off. Then you can see who the people really are, with whom you have come into contact in your passage to the world, for by the end of life characters have come out in their true light, actions have borne fruit, achievements have been rightly appreciated, and all shams have fallen to pieces. For this, time was in every case requisite. But the most curious fact is that it is also only towards the close of life that a man really recognizes and understands his own true self, the aims and objects he has followed in life, more especially the kind of relation in which he has stood to other people and to the world. It will often happen that as a result of this knowledge, a man will have to assign himself a lower place than he formerly thought was his due. But there are exceptions to this rule, and it will occasionally be the case that he will take a higher position than he had before. This will be owing to the fact that he had no adequate notion of the baseness of the world, and that he set up a higher aim for himself than that was followed by the rest of mankind. The progress of life shows a man the stuff of which he is made. It is customary to call youth the happy and age the sad part of life. This would be true if it were the passions that made a man happy. Youth is swayed to and fro by them, and they give a great deal of pain and very little pleasure. In age the passions cool and leave a man at rest, and then forthwith his mind takes a contemplative tone. The intellect is set free and attains the upper hand, and since in itself intellect is beyond the range of pain, and man feels happy just in so far as his intellect is the predominating part of him. It need only be remembered that all pleasure is negative, and that pain is positive in its nature, in order to see that the passions can never be a source of happiness, and that age is not the less to be envied on the ground that many pleasures are denied it. For every sort of pleasure is never anything more than the quietive of some need or longing, and that pleasure should come to an end as soon as the need ceases is no more a subject of complaint than that a man cannot go on eating after he has had his dinner, or fall asleep again after a good night's rest. Thus, so far from youth being the happiest period of life, there is much more truth in the remark made by Plato at the beginning of the Republic, that the prize should rather be given to old age, because then at last is man freed from the animal passion, which has hitherto never ceased to disquiet him. Nay, it may even be said that the countless and manifold humours which have their source in this passion, and the emotions that spring from it, produce a mild state of madness, and this lasts as long as the man is subject to the spell of the impulse, this evil spirit, as it were, of which there is no riddance, so that he never really becomes a reasonable being until the passion is extinguished. There is no doubt that, in general, and apart from individual circumstances and particular dispositions, youth is marked by a certain melancholy and sadness, while genial sentiments attach to old age, and the reason for this is nothing but the fact that the young man is still under the service, nay, the forced labor, imposed by that evil spirit, which scarcely ever leaves him a moment to himself. To this source may be traced, directly or indirectly, almost all and every ill that befalls or menaces mankind. The old man is genial and cheerful because, after long lying in the bonds of passion, he can now move about in freedom. Still, it should not be forgotten that when this passion is extinguished, the true kernel of life is gone, and nothing remains but the hollow shell, or, from another point of view, life then becomes like a comedy, which, though it was begun by real actors, is continued and brought to an end by automata dressed in their clothes. However that may be, youth is the period of unrest, and age is that of repose, and from that very circumstance, the relative degree of pleasure belonging to each may be inferred. The child stretches out its little hands in the eager desire to seize all the pretty things that meet its sight, charmed by the world because all its senses are still so young and fresh. Much the same thing happens with the youth, and he displays greater energy in his quest. He too is charmed by all the pretty things and the many pleasing shapes that surround him, and forthwith his imagination conjures up pleasures which the world can never realize. So he is filled with an ardent desire for he knows not what delights, robbing him of all rest and making happiness impossible. But when old age is reached, all this is over and done with, partly because the blood runs cooler, and the senses are no longer so easily allured, partly because experience has shown the true value of things and the futility of pleasure, whereby illusion has been gradually dispelled, and the strange fancies and prejudices which previously concealed or distorted a free and true view of the world have been dissipated and put to flight, with the result that a man can now get a juster and clearer view and see things as they are, and also in a measure attain more or less insight into the nullity of all things on this earth. It is this that gives almost every old man, no matter how ordinary his faculties may be, a certain tincture of wisdom, which distinguishes him from the young. But the chief result of all this change is the peace of mind that ensues, a great element in happiness, and in fact the condition and essence of it. While the young man fancies that there is a vast amount of good things in the world, if he could only come at them, the old man is steeped in the truth of the preacher's words, that all things are vanity, knowing that, however gilded the shell, the nut is hollow. In these later years, and not before, a man comes to a true appreciation of Horace's maxim, nil admirari. He is directly and sincerely convinced of the vanity of everything, and that all the glories of the world are as nothing. His illusions are gone. He is no more beset with the idea that there is any particular amount of happiness anywhere, in the palace or in the cottage, any more than he himself enjoys when he is free from bodily or mental pain. The worldly distinctions of great and small, high and low, exist for him no longer, and in this blissful state of mind the old man may look down with a smile upon all false notions. He is completely undeceived, and knows that whatever may be done to adorn human life and deck it out in finery, its paltry character will soon show through the glitter of its surroundings, and that, paint and bejewel it as one may, it remains everywhere much the same, an existence which has no true value except in freedom from pain, and is never to be estimated by the presence of pleasure, let alone, then, of display. Disillusion is the chief characteristic of old age, for by that time the fictions are gone which give life its charm and spurred on the mind to activity. The splendors of the world have been proved null and vain. Its pomp, grandeur, and magnificence are faded. A man has then found out that behind most of the things he wants, and most of the pleasures he longs for, there is very little after all. And so he comes by degrees to see that our existence is all empty and void. It is only when he is 70 years old that he quite understands the first words of the preacher, and this again explains why it is that old men are sometimes fretful and morose. It is often said that the common lot of old age is disease and weariness of life. Disease is by no means essential to old age, especially where a really long span of years is to be attained, for as life goes on, the conditions of health and disorder tend to increase, and as far as weariness or boredom is concerned, I have stated above why old age is even less exposed to that form of evil than youth. Nor is boredom by any means to be taken as a necessary accompaniment of that solitude, which, for reasons that do not require to be explained, old age certainly cannot escape. It is rather the fate that awaits those who have never known any other pleasures but the gratification of the senses and the delights of society, who have left their minds unenlightened and their faculties unused. It is quite true that the intellectual faculties decline with the approach of old age, but where they were originally strong, there will always be enough left to combat the onslaught of boredom. And then again, as I have said, experience, knowledge, reflection, and skill in dealing with men combine to give an old man an increasingly accurate insight into the ways of the world. His judgment becomes keen, and he attains a coherent view of life. His mental vision embraces a wider range, constantly finding new uses for his stores of knowledge and adding to them at every opportunity. He maintains uninterrupted that inward process of self-education, which gives employment and satisfaction to the mind, and thus forms the due reward of all its efforts. All this serves in some measure as a compensation for decreased intellectual power, and besides, time, as I have remarked, seems to go much more quickly when we are advanced in years, and this is in itself a preventive of boredom. There is no great harm in the fact that a man's bodily strength decreases in old age, unless indeed he requires it to make a living. But to be poor when one is old is a great misfortune. If a man is secure from that and retains his health, old age may be a very passable time of life. Its chief necessity is to be comfortable and well off, and in consequence, money is then prized more than ever, because it is a substitute for failing strength. Deserted by Venus, the old man likes to turn to Bacchus to make him merry. In the place of wanting to see things, to travel and learn, comes the desire to speak and to teach. It is a piece of good fortune if the old man retains some of his love of study, or of music, or of the theater, if, in general, he is still somewhat susceptible to the things about him, as is, indeed, the case with some people to a very late age. At that time of life, what a man has in himself is of greater advantage to him than ever it was before. There can be no doubt that most people who have never been anything but dull and stupid become more and more of automata as they grow old. They have always thought, said, and done the same things as their neighbors, and nothing that happens now can change their disposition, or make them act otherwise. To talk to old people of this kind is like writing on the sand. If you produce any impression at all, it is gone almost immediately. Old age is here nothing but the caput mortuum of life. All that is essential to manhood is gone. There are cases in which nature supplies a third set of teeth in old age, thereby apparently demonstrating the fact that that period of life is a second childhood. It is certainly a very melancholy thing that all of a man's faculties tend to waste away as he grows old, and at a rate that increases in rapidity. But still, this is a necessary, nay, a beneficial arrangement, as otherwise death, for which it is a preparation, would be too hard to bear. So, the greatest boon that follows the attainment of extreme old age is euthanasia, an easy death, not ushered in by disease, and free from all pain and struggle. For, let a man live as long as he may, he is never conscious of any moment but the present, one and indivisible, and in those late years the mind loses more every day by sheer forgetfulness than ever it gains anew. The main difference between youth and age will always be that the youth looks forward to life, and old age to death, and that while the one has a short past and a long future behind it, the case is just the opposite with the other. It is quite true that when a man is old, to die is the only thing that awaits him, while if he is young, he may expect to live, and the question arises which of the two fates is the more hazardous, and if life is not a matter which, on the whole, it is better to have behind one than before? Does not the preacher say, the day of death is better than the day of one's birth? It is certainly a rash thing to wish for a long life, for, as the Spanish proverb has it, it means to see much evil. In one of the Vedic Upanishads, Upnikat 2, the natural length of human life is put down at 100 years, and I believe this to be right. I have observed, as a matter of fact, that it is only people who exceed the age of 90 who attain euthanasia, who die, that is to say, of no disease, apoplexy, or convulsion, and pass away without agony of any sort, nay, who sometimes even show no pallor, but expire generally in a sitting attitude, and often after a meal, or, I may say, simply cease to live rather than to die. To come to one's end before the age of 90 means to die of disease, in other words, prematurely. Now, the Old Testament, Psalm 60:10, puts the limit of human life at 70, and if it is very long, at 80 years, and what is more noticeable still, Herodotus, I-32 and 3:22, says the same thing. But this is wrong, and the error is due simply to a rough and superficial estimate of the results of daily experience. For if the natural length of life were from 70 to 80 years, people would die about that time of mere old age. Now, this is certainly not the case. If they die then, they die, like younger people, of disease, and disease is something abnormal. Therefore, it is not natural to die at that age. It is only when they are between 90 and 100 that people die of old age. Die, I mean, without suffering from any disease, or showing any special signs of their condition, such as a struggle, death rattle, convulsion, or pallor, the absence of all which constitutes euthanasia. The natural length of human life is 100 years, and in assigning that limit, the Upanishads are right once more. A man's individual career is not, as astrology wishes to make out, to be predicted from observation of the planets, but the course of human life in general, as far as the various periods of it are concerned, may be likened to the succession of the planets, so that we may be said to pass under the influence of each one of them in turn. At 10, Mercury is in the ascendant, and at that age a youth, like this planet, is characterized by extreme mobility within a narrow sphere, where trifles have a great effect upon him. But under the guidance of so crafty and eloquent a god, he easily makes great progress. Venus begins her sway during his 20th year, and then a man is wholly given up to the love of women. At 30, Mars comes to the front, and he is now all energy and strength, daring, pugnacious, and arrogant. When a man reaches the age of 40, he is under the rule of the 4 asteroids. That is to say, his life has gained something in extension. He is frugal. In other words, with the help of Ceres, he favors what is useful. He has his own hearth, by the influence of Vesta. Pallas has taught him that which is necessary for him to know, and his wife, his Juno, rules as the mistress of his house. But at the age of 50, Jupiter is the dominant influence. At that period, a man has outlived most of his contemporaries, and he can feel himself superior to the generation about him. He is still in the full enjoyment of his strength, and rich in experience and knowledge, and if he has any power and position of his own, he is endowed with authority over all who stand in his immediate surroundings. He is no more inclined to receive orders from others, and he wants to take command himself. The work most suitable to him now is to guide and rule within his own sphere. This is the point where Jupiter culminates, and where the man of 50 years is at his best. Then comes Saturn at about the age of 60, a weight as of lead, dull and slow. But old folks, many feign as they were dead, unwieldy, slow, heavy, and pale as lead. Last of all, Uranus, or as the saying is, a man goes to heaven. I cannot find a place for Neptune, as this planet has been very thoughtlessly named, because I may not call it as it should be called, Eros. Otherwise I should point out how beginning and end meet together, and how closely and intimately Eros is connected with death, how Orcus, or Amenethes, as the Egyptians called him, is not only the receiver, but the giver of all things. Death is the great reservoir of life. Everything comes from Orcus. Everything that is alive now was once there. Could we but understand the great trick by which that is done, then all would be clear.